It was 2 a.m. when I found myself frozen underneath the old bed in my mother's guest room, the air thick with dust and dread. I hadn't been home in years, and yet there I was, curled up like a child, arms wrapped around my legs, trembling, my breath shallow so I wouldn't make a sound. Upstairs, I had heard screaming. Not the kind of yelling that comes with family disagreements, but something raw and animalistic. I'd barely had time to make it down the hallway before I saw him, Ron, towering over my sister Emily in the living room, his fists clenched, face flushed with rage. Her arms were up trying to shield her face, but he wasn't stopping. The sound of each blow hitting her body felt louder than my own heartbeat. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My legs had carried me only as far as the guest room, where I now cowered under the bed, the wooden floor cold against my cheek, the springs above me creaking every time I flinched. From my position, I couldn't see much, only the faint glow of the hallway light, the shifting shadows of their bodies. Then came the sickening sound. Skin against skin, a thud, a choked cry from Emily. I knew that sound. I had heard it years ago. Nothing had changed. And just as I was about to crawl out to do something, I heard another voice. Softer, closer, horrifying. My mother. "Don't interfere!" "Rachel," she whispered from behind the door, her tone not frightened, not broken, but resolute. I turned my head, eyes wide, straining to understand. "It's not your place," she added, as if explaining a house rule. Her silhouette lingered for a moment, then disappeared back into the dark. I lay there, mouth dry, heart pounding, the words echoing louder than Ron's fists. My mother knew. She had always known. And she chose silence, again. I pressed my forehead to the floor to stop the room from spinning. Emily screamed again, this time more of a whimper. The kind of noise you make when you realize no one is coming. That was the moment something inside me cracked, not like a twig, but like a dam bursting, years of swallowed pain and unresolved guilt flooding through. I didn't cry, I didn't panic. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and hit record. If I couldn't save Emily in that moment, I would make damn sure no one ever pretended this didn't happen again. I didn't sleep that night. Not a second. I sat in my car, parked 2 blocks away from the house I used to call home, staring at the empty street through a fogged-up windshield, listening to the silence that followed the violence. Emily was still inside. I had offered to take her with me, but she had just shaken her head, dazed and bloody, whispering that she couldn't leave yet. That she didn't have anywhere else to go. I wanted to scream. Instead, I just drove off, knowing I was leaving her behind in the same war zone that raised me. The weight of that guilt settled in my chest like wet cement. I remember once when I was 12 sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and Ron had walked in angry because I forgot to put away the dishes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw anything. He just picked up my math book and tore it in half without blinking. Then he stared me down for what felt like hours. I didn't cry. I learned quickly that tears were ammunition in his world. They fed his need to dominate. I became a master of silence. That silence followed me into adulthood, creeping into my relationships, into my sleep, into the way I second-guessed every decision I made. I was always waiting for the next emotional punch, even when it never came. Every creak of a floorboard, every slammed door, every raised voice in a movie made my body flinch involuntarily. People would say I was sensitive, overly alert, too guarded. I would smile politely and agree, never bothering to explain how growing up in a house where love was conditional rewires your brain. My therapist once told me that children in abusive households develop hypervigilance as a survival mechanism. It's like having a radar that's always scanning for danger, always predicting the next storm. But no one tells you that when you grow up, the radar doesn't turn off. It just keeps running, draining your energy, your joy, your ability to trust. I built my adult life like a fortress. I lived alone. I worked in finance where numbers made sense and people didn't lie. I kept friends at a distance, never let anyone into my apartment unless absolutely necessary. I didn't date. I didn't drink. I didn't let myself be vulnerable, not once, because vulnerability was a currency I couldn't afford. And yet, that night under the bed, all those years of calculated self-protection collapsed into dust. I was 11 again. I was voiceless. I was watching someone I loved get broken while I did nothing. The guilt was unbearable, but more than that, it was familiar. And that's what terrified me. Not that Emily was being hurt, but that I had come to expect this, that some part of me believed she was supposed to endure it, that this was just our family's way. Trauma doesn't just scar you, it shapes your blueprint. It decides who you believe you are and what you think you deserve. For years, I believed I had escaped that house unscathed because I had avoided bruises. But bruises fade, the silence that stays, the self-doubt that lingers, the internalized voice that whispers you're too dramatic, too weak, too selfish for speaking up, it becomes your own. And it took standing under that bed watching my mother do nothing while Emily screamed to realize I had never escaped. I had just learned to survive quieter. That's the cost of living in a toxic home. You either become the aggressor, the enabler, or the ghost. And I had chosen to disappear, but now I had proof, and I had a choice. I could either keep playing dead, or I could make sure someone finally paid for what was done to us. Not just Ron, but the silence, the complicity, the years stolen from girls who only wanted to feel safe in their own home. People always assume the beginning of a toxic family story starts with the violence, but that's rarely true. Ours began with charm, with the kind of warm, persuasive energy that makes everyone in the room feel special. That was Ron. He entered our lives when I was 11 and Emily was 13, a man with perfect teeth and cologne that lingered in every hallway like a promise. My mother met him at the clinic where she worked as a nurse. He was there for a sprained wrist he said he'd fallen during a hike and apparently charmed every staff member by the time he left. My mother called him a breath of fresh air. After my father walked out, she had been emotionally flatlined for years. Then suddenly she was giggling on the phone at night buying new lipstick humming while she did the dishes. When she introduced us to Ron, he brought gifts. Not just for us, but for our teachers, our neighbors, even the family dog. At first, I thought he was incredible. He noticed things. He asked about my art projects, remembered my teacher's name helped Emily with science homework. Mom looked at him like he was made of gold, like he'd rescued her from a life she'd given up on. We all wanted to believe that. So when the cracks started to show, we looked away. The first red flag was subtle. Ron started joking about Emily being a little too dramatic when she cried during movies. Then it became comments about what she wore, how she laughed, how she always needed attention. At dinner, he'd talk over her, then accuse her of interrupting. With me, he was more calculated. He made me feel like the golden child, quiet, obedient, thoughtful. He praised me for not being difficult like Emily. At first, I liked the praise. It felt like safety, but over time, I began to understand the game. Ron was dividing us, isolating us from each other, making sure we never stood on the same side. He watched everything, who we texted, how long we were in the bathroom, what shows we watched. Our family life became a performance, and Ron was the director. Mom changed too. Her independence vanished. She started asking Ron before making any decision, big or small. She stopped going out with her coworkers, stopped calling her sister. She said she didn't have time, but we knew better. Ron didn't like her friends. He said they were bad influences, that they filled her head with nonsense. Slowly, the house became smaller, quieter, more controlled. We had to ask permission for everything. Going to the store, using the computer, having friends over. And if we asked at the wrong time or with the wrong tone, the punishment wasn't always physical, but it was always felt. Doors slammed, silence stretched for days. Food disappeared from the fridge. Favorite toys went missing. Once Emily found her journal in the trash pages torn out and burned in the fire pit. Ron said nothing. Mom just said she should have locked it up better. Emily started pushing back. She yelled, slammed her own door, skipped school. And for every act of rebellion, Ron escalated. He grounded her for weeks, took her phone, pulled her from extracurriculars. Mom defended him every time, saying he was trying to teach discipline. He's not your father, but he loves you like one, she'd say, as if that justified the surveillance, the constant suspicion, the control. I withdrew. I did everything right. Straight as early curfews, polite conversations. I thought if I stayed invisible, I'd be safe, but safety was never guaranteed. I remember once waking up to shouting at 3 a.m. and finding Emily curled in the hallway with a bloody lip. Ron stood over her, breathing hard. Mom didn't even come out of the bedroom. Emily looked up at me with eyes so full of betrayal it hurt to meet them. She didn't need me to call the police. She needed me to pick her up off the floor. I didn't. I went back to bed and cried into my pillow so no one would hear. That was the night Emily stopped talking to me. After that, she was just a ghost in the house. Ron had succeeded. He broke her spirit and our bond. Mom said Emily was going through a phase, but we all knew better. She was surviving the only way she could with silence and dissociation. As for me, I kept playing the role. The good daughter, the easy one. But even perfect obedience couldn't protect me from the tension that lived in every wall of that house. I hated weekends. I hated holidays. I hated walking on eggshells in my own home. But what I hated most was the woman who used to sing lullabies now standing in the kitchen watching it all happen doing nothing. I used to wonder if she even noticed what she'd become. But after that night under the bed when she whispered for me not to interfere, I realized she did know. She had just made her choice a long time ago. By the time Emily was 16, the tension in the house had calcified into something unspoken but inescapable, like mold in the walls or a gas leak you couldn't smell but always felt. Every day was a test we never got to study for. Ron had turned discipline into a ritual. He began with rules: what clothes were acceptable, what music was allowed, how long we could shower. Then came the restrictions. No locked doors, no social media, no sleepovers. He told us we were safer that way. I remember the way Emily's laughter changed. It used to be this full-bodied thing that came from her chest, but around Ron it became tight shallow, like she was always holding part of it back. She started hiding things: books under her mattress, makeup in her backpack, a burner phone tucked inside a shoe. She had this way of rolling her eyes that was both brave and dangerous. Ron noticed. One night I heard them fighting in the garage. She had refused to give him her real phone password. When I peeked through the side door, I saw her pinned against the workbench, his hand around her wrist, her face twisted in fear and fury. Mom stood by the washer, arms crossed, saying nothing. That image seared into my mind like a brand. I wanted to scream to run in, but instead I closed the door quietly and went back upstairs. I didn't sleep that night, and I couldn't look Emily in the eye the next morning. She stopped trying after that. Her rebellion took quieter forms, skipping meals, sleeping through the day, refusing to answer anyone. She failed her junior year. Ron called her lazy. Mom said she needed to learn accountability. No one asked what she was trying to escape from. Meanwhile, I leaned harder into perfection. I got a part-time job, applied to scholarships, cleaned obsessively. I thought maybe if I was perfect enough, Ron would leave her alone. That maybe he'd shift focus, or Mom would finally see the contrast and snap out of it. But it didn't work like that. Control doesn't reward obedience, it demands more of it. Ron began calling me his calm one, which made me sick. He'd pat my shoulder at dinner, offer me wine with a wink, tell Mom I was mature beyond my years. It didn't feel like praise. It felt like possession. The worst part, Emily saw it. One night she hissed at me. "You think you're safe just because you smile through it?" I wanted to explain that I wasn't safe. I was just silent, that I hadn't chosen sides, I was just surviving. But by then, we spoke different languages. The bond we'd had as kids, the late-night whisper sessions, the sisterhood, it had been strangled by fear and strategy. The final crack came the summer before I left for college. Emily had started sneaking out at night, just walking to the park and sitting there alone, needing space. Ron caught her returning one morning. He waited until Mom left for groceries, then dragged Emily into the living room and threw her onto the floor. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, toothbrush still in hand, as he screamed that she was a whore, a liar, a disgrace. He kicked over the coffee table. Emily stood chin high and spat at his feet. That's when he slapped her. Hard. Not a reflex, not an outburst, calculated, brutal. The sound echoed through the house. My body moved without permission. I stepped forward, hand-shaking voice, rising, yelling, "Stop!" For a split second, everything went still. Ron turned to me with the slow, controlled rage of a man not used to being questioned. "Excuse me," he said, stepping toward me. That was when Mom walked in, bags of groceries dangling from her arms. She looked at the overturned table, at Emily's swelling face, at me with my hand half raised in protest. And she sighed. Not in shock, in disappointment. Girls, she said, like we had created the chaos. Then she told us both to go to our rooms. No consequences, no questions. Just go. Emily stormed past me, shoulders shaking, and that night she didn't come home. She spent 3 days at a friend's house before Mom dragged her back. That incident was never mentioned again. Ron went back to humming in the kitchen. Mom set the table. Emily stared at her food. And me. I counted the days until college. I left for university on a bus at 6 a.m. No hugs. No goodbye. Just an envelope of cash from Mom and a warning from Ron. You'd better not make us look bad out there. I never planned to return, and I didn't not for 8 long years, until the night Emily called. Until the night everything I thought I had outrun came crashing back with a single whisper. Don't interfere. I was halfway through my junior year at university when I got the news that Emily had dropped out. No explanation, no forwarded transcripts, just a single text from Mom. Emily made her choice. That was how she framed everything. Decisions blame silence. Emily had apparently been working at a diner on the outskirts of town, barely making rent, and sleeping on a friend's couch. I offered to help. I texted, called, even mailed a letter, but nothing came back. Months passed, then a year. Eventually, I stopped trying, burying my concern under school jobs and a carefully structured life that left little space for anything unresolved. I told myself that if she wanted me, she'd reach out. I told myself that I wasn't the enemy, but I knew better. I had been silent when it counted. The guilt had hardened inside me like a second skeleton. Then on a Sunday in late March, the phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, but something in my gut twisted. I answered. Rachel. The voice was hoarse, whispery, cautious. Emily. I asked, heart immediately in my throat. She didn't confirm it. She just said I need help. I don't know who else to call. My blood ran cold. I hadn't heard her voice in nearly 7 years, and now she was calling me like a ghost crawling back through a grave I thought we'd both buried. I asked where she was. She said, home. That word hit me like a punch. She meant our mother's house, Ron's house. I asked why. She paused, then said, it's complicated. Just, can you come? The logical part of me screamed no, but the guilt, the buried love, the unspoken apology all converged, and before I could think, I said yes. I packed a bag, notified my manager I'd be out sick, and drove 5 hours in a fog. The house looked the same, paint peeling slightly from the trim wind chimes clinking near the porch flower beds unkept. It was like someone had hit pause years ago. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a long time, staring at the front door, trying to decide if this was a rescue or a relapse. When I finally rang the bell, it was Mom who answered. She looked older, thinner, like someone had drained the color from her, but her eyes green and sharp like mine still held that cool detachment. Rachel, she said flatly, then stepped aside. No hug, no emotion. Emily was in the guest room lying on the bed with the blankets pulled up to her chin. Her face was bruised. Not fresh, not raw, but healing, the kind of marks you get when violence is routine. I rushed to her side, whispered her name, touched her hand. She flinched. I'm okay, she said, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I just wanted someone to know. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat beside her until she drifted off, then wandered the hallway listening. That's when I heard it, the voice. Ron speaking low and slow somewhere down the hall, talking to Mom. You coddle them, he was saying. That's why they're like this. Mom murmured something I couldn't catch. Ron again, I won't let this family fall apart because of their weakness. I wanted to scream. Instead, I walked back to the guest room and locked the door. But that lock, like everything else in that house, was more symbolic than real. The next night it happened. The storm, the eruption. Emily had refused to hand over her phone. Ron accused her of hiding something. Mom watched silent as ever. Emily stood her ground for all of 5 seconds before Ron shoved her against the wall. I heard the thud from the hallway. I ran, but by the time I got to the living room, she was already on the floor. He was shouting. She was curled in a fetal position. And Mom Mom stood in the corner like a statue carved from cowardice. I did what I'd trained myself not to do. I reacted. I shouted, "Stop!" Ron turned eyes wild and pointed at me. "You don't tell me what to do in my house. My house!" The words stabbed like knives. I stepped forward, fists clenched, but Mom raised a hand. "Not to stop him, to stop me. Don't interfere," she said, her voice even. "This doesn't concern you." I stared at her, blinking, trying to understand how a mother could witness this and say those words. But then I realized this wasn't new. This was the same line she'd always walked, a spectator with too much pride and too little courage. I backed away, shaking. I found myself in the guest room. I climbed under the bed like a child, like I used to do during storms. I thought it would pass, that maybe he'd stop, that maybe Mom would finally intervene, but the blows kept coming. The screams got quieter. That's when I reached for my phone, and that's when everything changed. I hit record. Not just video, but audio, too. I wanted every word, every sound. I wanted proof. Because this time, I wasn't going to pretend it was a bad dream. This time, someone was going to pay. The next morning, I left before sunrise. Emily begged me not to say anything. I kissed her forehead and lied. Okay, but inside, I was already planning. The trust was broken irreparably. But I could use the pieces. I could turn them into weapons, and I would. Driving away from that house felt like waking up from a coma. The sun had just started to rise, bleeding orange across the sky, but everything in me felt gray, hollowed out like I had left a part of myself under that bed. I didn't go home. I drove to a rest stop parked under a flickering light and replayed the audio on my phone. Every scream, every blow, my mother's silence, my own breath caught in my throat. Proof. That word echoed in my mind. For so long, everything that happened in that house had lived in shadows. Now I had light, but I didn't know what to do with it. So I called someone I hadn't spoken to in a year. Lauren, a former coworker turned legal advocate. She picked up groggy, but when I said I have evidence of domestic abuse, she snapped awake. I told her everything. Not just about Emily, but about my childhood, the silence, the patterns, the whisper under the bed. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You need to take this to someone who can do more than sympathize." Within 24 hours, she connected me with a domestic violence nonprofit. They assigned me a caseworker named Felicia, a woman in her 50s with a calm voice and a way of speaking that made you believe she'd seen worse and survived. When I showed her the recordings, she didn't flinch. "This," she said, "is enough to open an investigation." I nodded, but part of me still hesitated. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I doubted the system. What if they dismissed it? What if they spun it like they always did, that Emily was unstable, that Ron was disciplining that Mom didn't know, but Felicia didn't give me room to spiral? She laid out the process: police report, emergency protective order, a wellness check. She also warned me, there will be pushback from your mother, maybe even from your sister. Victims don't always want rescuing. Sometimes they just want silence. That hit me hard, because I knew she was right. I'd seen it in Emily's eyes, the fear of exposure, the shame of being seen as broken. But I also knew this couldn't go on. I wasn't asking for her permission to act. I was asking for the strength to carry through. That same day, I filed the report. I handed over the audio, detailed the years of abuse, named Ron as the primary abuser and Mom as complicit. It felt like vomiting poison I'd been holding for decades. And it didn't stop there. I contacted Aunt Marianne, Mom's sister, who had been estranged for years after one too many fights about Ron. I sent her the recording. Her response came in all caps. I knew it. She told me stories I'd never heard about how Mom cut off friends who questioned Ron, how she once told a coworker to mind her own business when they saw Emily's bruises. The image of my mother I'd clung to, the reluctant victim, the woman too scared to leave, was unraveling fast. She wasn't just complicit. She had protected him, maybe even enabled him. That truth was harder than anything Ron had ever done to me, because it meant that love alone doesn't make someone safe. It doesn't make them good. It doesn't make them worthy. I thought about confronting her, sending the recording, letting her know that I knew, but Felicia advised against it. She'll circle the wagons, let the system speak first. So I waited. 3 days, then 4. Until one morning I got a call from a restricted number. It was the local police. They had visited the house, spoke to Emily, confirmed visible injuries. Ron had been temporarily removed pending investigation. Mom had refused to speak. Emily had given a partial statement. My hands trembled as I hung up. It had begun. The silence was cracking. The spell was breaking, and this time I wasn't just watching. I was the one pulling the thread. The first time I saw Emily after the report, she didn't hug me. She didn't smile or cry. She just stood there in the doorway of a temporary shelter, arms crossed, eyes swollen from more than just sleep deprivation. "They took him," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of relief. "And Mom hasn't said a word to me since." I stepped forward, unsure if she'd let me in, and after a long pause, she moved aside. The room was small, 2 cots, a metal dresser, one window that overlooked a brick wall, but it felt safer than anywhere we'd ever lived. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers worrying a string on her hoodie. "You shouldn't have done it," she murmured. "I told you not to interfere." I didn't respond right away. I sat across from her and took a breath that felt like inhaling glass. "I didn't do it to save you," I said quietly. "I did it to save us. You, me. The girls we were and the women we're still becoming." That was the moment the walls started to come down. Not completely, but enough. Over the next week, I visited every day. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just sat in silence. I brought her fresh clothes, toiletries, her favorite instant noodles. I found a counselor through the nonprofit, someone who specialized in trauma bonds and long-term domestic abuse. At first, Emily refused. Then she agreed to one session, then another. She was healing inch by inch, and so was I. But healing wasn't enough. I wanted justice, not just a legal slap on the wrist or a temporary order that could be revoked. I wanted people to know what had happened. I wanted it public, documented, unignorable. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I uploaded the recording. Not to social media, not yet, but to a secure cloud folder I shared with journalists, local activists, and attorneys. I included transcripts, timelines, affidavits, witness statements. I created a trail too wide to cover up. The local paper picked up the story first. Anonymous whistleblower exposes years of abuse in respected suburban home. Then a podcast requested an interview. Then a national women's rights organization reached out. I didn't show my face. Not yet, but the story was spreading. The shame that had once strangled me was now a spotlight, and I was finally aiming it at the right people. The real shift happened when Ron's employer, a regional contractor, issued a statement distancing themselves from him. The house of cards began to wobble. Mom was still in it, still trying to hold it up. She hired a lawyer. Claimed Ron had anger issues but denied knowledge of long-term abuse. Claimed Emily was emotionally unstable and I was vindictive. But she underestimated how much had changed. We weren't voiceless anymore. Emily gave a full statement to police, described in detail the years of escalation, the bruises, the threats, the times Mom watched. I supplemented it with recordings, photos, journal entries. Even Aunt Marianne stepped forward offering testimony about Mom's dismissiveness and aggression toward anyone who questioned Ron. The prosecutor built a case not just for domestic violence, but for enabling coercion and child endangerment. The charges weren't flashy, this wasn't a Netflix special, but they were real, tangible, and they stuck. One day, I stood outside the courthouse holding a copy of the police report and a grainy photo of Emily at 14 eyes, hollow arm, bruised. I stared at it until my hands stopped shaking. Then I handed it to the journalist waiting nearby. "You can print this," I said. "You can print everything." A week later, the article went live, an expose with our names redacted but our truths intact. The response was seismic. Messages poured in from women across the country, survivors, sisters, daughters, who had lived our same story in different homes, different zip codes. One woman wrote, "You told my story before I had the courage to tell it myself." Another said, "I'm leaving tonight. I didn't think I could until now." The momentum didn't stop. The nonprofit offered me a part-time role helping others navigate legal reporting. Emily started volunteering at the shelter, helping younger girls find safe housing. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were fighting. Every step forward was a step out of the fog, but it wasn't clean. There were nights when Emily called me in tears, wondering if she'd ever feel whole. Days when I couldn't focus at work, flooded with memories of slammed doors and silent dinners. But we had something we never had before each other and a reason to keep going. One afternoon, as we sat on a park bench sharing a thermos of coffee, Emily turned to me and asked, "Do you think she ever loved us?" I didn't know how to answer that. Maybe she did once. Maybe love wasn't the issue. Maybe survival had warped her into someone who couldn't distinguish loyalty from complicity. But I didn't say that. I just said I think she chose him. Every day, she chose him. Emily nodded slowly, the wind catching her hair. "Not anymore," she said. And in that moment, I knew we were finally free, not because the system had saved us, but because we had saved each other, because we had stopped waiting for permission to speak, and because we had learned that telling the truth was the most powerful form of resistance we had. The day Ron was formally charged, I didn't go to the courthouse. I sat outside in my car engine off, staring at the double doors, watching reporters cluster near the steps like vultures waiting for a carcass of truth. I had already done my part, the statements, the recordings, the interviews. But when Emily called me from inside, her voice trembling, saying, "They took him in cuffs, Rachel," he didn't say a word. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. The charges weren't just symbolic, they were real felony domestic assault, aggravated battery, and coercive control, a newer charge in our state that allowed prosecutors to recognize patterns of emotional and psychological abuse. Emily's bruises spoke volumes, but so did the years of silence we had broken open like a dam. Ron's lawyer argued temporary stress, claimed disciplinary misinterpretations, and painted Ron as a man struggling under financial pressure. But it didn't stick. The evidence was too loud, the recordings too clear, the public pressure too sharp. In the courtroom, Emily sat on the witness stand with her shoulders square and her voice firm. She recounted everything from the locked doors to the cold dinners, the slaps, the kicks, the way Ron would call her worthless and Mom would look away. She didn't cry. But every time she paused, I saw her jaw tighten like she was holding back a lifetime of screaming. When my turn came, I testified as a corroborating witness. I spoke about the night I hid under the bed, the whisper that broke me, the betrayal that felt louder than any slap. I told the court how I once believed silence was survival, but it had nearly killed us. Ron didn't look at me once, but my mother did. She sat behind him, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Her eyes met mine like a challenge, like she still believed she could spin this, that I was ungrateful, that I had destroyed our family. But I didn't look away. I wanted her to see what she'd raised and what I had survived despite her. A week later, Ron accepted a plea deal, 10 years in prison, 5 without parole, registered domestic offender status for life. No courtroom apology, no final confession, just paperwork and handcuffs. But it was enough, for now. Mom wasn't charged with a crime, but the prosecutors made it clear her silence had consequences. She was issued a restraining order and formally barred from contacting either of us. She tried, of course. A letter arrived at my apartment scrawled in her old nurse's handwriting. She said she was sorry I felt hurt, that she hoped I could understand how complicated things had been, that she only ever wanted what was best. I didn't open it. I shredded it and watched the pieces fall like ash. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness in this case would be a lie. Ron lost his job, his pension, and most of his social circle. The man who once controlled every inch of our lives now existed behind a locked door with no power over anything, but his absence did not undo what had been done. Emily still flinched when doors closed too loudly. I still slept with the hallway light on. Some scars don't fade, they just change shape. Still, justice even in pieces is better than silence. What surprised me most was the ripple effect. Other women in our town came forward, neighbors, co-workers, even one of Mom's old friends, each with stories of watching suspecting staying quiet. Some admitted guilt. Others just wanted to be heard. One woman said, "I saw the way he looked at you girls and I said nothing. I'm sorry." That meant more than she knew. Not because it changed the past, but because it proved we weren't crazy, that someone had noticed, that we had never been invisible. Emily and I attended a support group together for a while. The first few sessions were awkward, but then we began speaking. Not just about Ron or Mom, but about fear identity rebuilding. One evening, after a particularly heavy session, Emily turned to me and said, "I don't hate her. I just hate who I had to become because of her." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. That sentence summed up everything. In the weeks that followed, Emily legally changed her last name. I kept mine not because I wanted to carry it, but because I had transformed it. The name Moore no longer belonged to Deborah or Ron. It belonged to us, survivors, fighters, truth-tellers, and Ron. He became what he always was, a coward hiding behind fear, now with no one left to protect him, no one left to silence us, no one left to believe the lie. The first time I laughed, really laughed after everything, it was over, something stupid. Emily and I were trying to assemble a bookshelf in my tiny apartment, and one of the wooden pegs snapped in half while she was trying to hammer it in with the heel of her sneaker. She let out this frustrated grunt, her face twisting in dramatic rage, and I couldn't help it. The laugh burst out of me, loud and full and completely unexpected. She froze, then started laughing too. We collapsed on the floor, surrounded by screwdrivers, broken wood, and open IKEA instructions we couldn't decipher if our lives depended on it. It wasn't just a laugh. It was a signal. A shift. Something had changed. The air didn't feel so heavy anymore. We weren't defined by the house we grew up in, or the horrors that happened within its walls. We were building something new, unstable, but ours. After Ron's sentencing and Mom's official disappearance from our lives, I started seeing a therapist regularly. Not just to deal with trauma, but to figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly bracing for violence. It's a strange thing trying to untangle yourself from a past that shaped every corner of your identity. I had spent so many years trying to be invisible to avoid being the target to not set him off. Now I had space to take up room, and I didn't know what to do with it. Dr. Shaw. My therapist helped me piece together the fractured parts of myself. We didn't just talk about the abuse. We talked about ambition, joy, creativity. She asked what made me feel alive, and I realized I didn't know the answer. So I started experimenting. I took a pottery class. I learned to cook actual meals instead of just microwaving frozen dinners. I dyed my hair purple. I let myself feel pretty again, not for attention, but for me. I stopped dressing in layers to hide my body. I wore red lipstick even when no one else would see it. I found new ways to take ownership over a body and a life that had once been someone else's to control. Emily did her own healing too. She enrolled in community college and started studying psychology. "I want to work with girls like us," she told me one evening as we sat on the roof of her dorm building watching the sunset bleed across the sky. "Not just help them survive, help them become." I felt pride swell in my chest, deeper than anything I'd ever known. This was the girl who used to curl into a ball whenever someone raised their voice. Now she was planning a future where she would be the voice. I started writing, at first just in a journal, then blog posts, then essays. Eventually, one of my pieces about growing up in a house ruled by silence was published in a small online magazine. The response was overwhelming. Women wrote to me from all over saying things like, "I thought I was alone," or "You said what I've never been able to say." I printed those messages out and taped them to my wall. Not as trophies, but as reminders. Proof that our pain could mean something. That surviving wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. I learned to say no without apologizing, to set boundaries without guilt, to speak my truth even when it made other people uncomfortable. I stopped explaining myself to people who didn't want to understand. Some old friends drifted away. They didn't know how to talk to the new me. But better friends came in people who didn't flinch when I mentioned trauma, or who didn't try to fix me. Just listened. Just stayed. The biggest moment came the day I stood in front of a packed auditorium at a local university to give a talk about resilience. I looked out at a sea of young faces, some curious, some skeptical, some visibly broken, and I said, "There was a time I believed love meant obedience, that loyalty meant silence, that survival meant never telling the truth. I was wrong." I told them about the bed, the whispers, the bruises, the night I chose to stop hiding. And then I told them about what came after the healing, the laughter, the bookshelf we built with our bare hands and broken hearts. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just told the truth. And afterward, a girl no older than 19 came up to me, eyes full of tears, and whispered, "I think you saved me." That was when I knew I had found my worth, not in spite of what I had lived through, but because I had turned it into something that could not be broken. Not by fists, not by silence, not even by the people who were supposed to love me. I was not the girl under the bed anymore. I was the woman who burned the bed down and built something better in its place. I used to believe that silence kept you safe, that looking away was the same as protecting someone, that love meant enduring whatever pain it brought. That's what I learned in the house where whispers were louder than screams, and every broken dish was swept under the rug before the neighbors could see. But now I know the truth. Silence is a prison, and the only way out is to shatter it completely. You don't escape a toxic family by hoping they change. You escape by changing yourself, by choosing to see clearly, to speak honestly, to draw a line in the sand and say, "This ends with me." And breaking that cycle hurts. It isn't a clean cut. It's messy and brutal and filled with guilt that doesn't always go away just because you made the right decision. But it's the kind of pain that leads somewhere new, somewhere free. When I look at Emily now, I don't just see my sister. I see someone who could have disappeared inside that house forever, someone who might have grown into a woman who whispered like Mom or controlled like Ron. But she didn't. She chose something else. And I did too. We broke a pattern that was generations deep, written in the language of fear and control, and learned helplessness. We weren't supposed to. Everything in us was designed to keep us in that loop. But we chose differently. And that choice is what I want to pass on to anyone listening. You are not obligated to bleed for people just because they share your blood. Love without respect is not love. Family without safety is not family. And being born into a nightmare does not mean you have to die in it. If your story feels familiar, if you've ever hidden under a bed or behind a smile or inside a version of yourself that only existed to keep someone else from exploding, please know that it can get better. It's not easy, it's not quick, and it doesn't happen all at once. But healing is possible. Peace is possible. Even joy is possible. I've seen it. I've lived it. I've walked barefoot across the wreckage of my past and made it to solid ground. You can too. And if you think you don't have the strength, borrow mine until you find your own. The most radical act of love you can commit is choosing yourself. Not in selfishness, but in truth, in choosing to live a life that is honest and safe and deeply yours. I didn't get that from my mother. She chose fear. She chose silence. She chose him. But I've learned that family isn't about who raised you. It's about who shows up, who listens, who believes you, and most importantly, who refuses to let your pain go unseen. You get to build that kind of family now, with friends, with partners, with yourself. I used to think I lost everything that night, but what I really lost was the illusion. And what I gained, my freedom, my voice, my future is worth everything it cost. So if you're at the edge right now, if you're still in the dark, wondering if your story matters, I want you to hear me loud and clear. It does. You do. And you are not alone. Not anymore.